An often debated topic regarding the story of Death Note is whether or not the Death Note corrupted Light Yagami when he picked it up. Why people think this seems to come down to them thinking and feeling bad for Light, wanting to downplay his own agency in the crimes he commits. But is it true? Well, there is no 100% explicit given answer in the series itself, but let's take a look and figure some things out. Many people note that Light quickly gets into the idea of killing and takes a liking to using the notebook as a justification for this theory, and people point to how once Light loses the notebook during the Yotsuba arc, he acts completely differently and stands against Kira, but people seem to ignore some crucial scenes that show more of Light's mindset and why Light does what he does. First, let's look at Light's thoughts as soon as he kills his second victim, where he confirms that he did, in fact, have the power to kill someone. Within the manga, he makes mention that the man didn't really deserve to die for what he did. Side note, in the manga, the man's crimes was catcalling and harassing a lady, while the anime took it a step further and made it into an attempted SA, and accordingly omits Light's feelings that he didn't deserve it. He probably wasn't that good a guy in the manga, but as Light said, what he did didn't warrant death. Light immediately says that he had these thoughts before, which is something that he mentions later. He was just now finally given the ability to act on them. And while he does mention that the Death Note seems to have some kind of power that draws people to use it, but this is right after Ryuk already debunked a lot of Light's assumptions about his receiving the book, such as him having to give up his soul or being chosen for it. Plus, Ryuk neither confirms nor denies this, leaving it vague whether or not it's true. But now, let's look at some other things, such as the other three Kiras. Misa and Mikami were already clearly screwed up in the head before getting the notebook and Light's manipulations. They were most definitely not stable individuals, as shown by their paths and behaviors that the Death Note would not have had an influence on. Their extensive use of the Death Notes is a result of their devotion to Light, rather than them being corrupted by it. And Kyosuke Higuchi is already a scummy businessman, and while we don't see him without the Death Note, he was chosen by Rem because he was someone whom Light could use for his goals. This gives us some indication that he wasn't corrupted by the Death Note, he was always a bad person. Then, let's also look at Ray Penber and Soichiro Yagami. Ray Penber did write in a Death Note, but he was forced to do it and didn't know what it was. And Chief Yagami held the Death Note in his hands, knew what it was, and wanted to use it, but in the end, couldn't bring himself to do it. These kind of put a hole in Light's theory that the book inherently corrupts people who held it. Sure, Ray didn't know he was holding the Death Note, but I sincerely doubt that if the book held corruptive properties, knowing or not knowing would stop people from being compelled to use it. Probably the next thing people will point to is when Light loses his memory at the start of the Yotsuba arc, he acts like a completely different person and stands against Kira, thinking that the difference in how he acts must be because the book is inherently corruptive. But this is really a case of people ignoring what the narrative presents as what made Light what he was. Light always had these thoughts of wanting to get rid of quote-unquote evil even before he picked up the book. And he himself, in the Yotsuba arc, compares his philosophy to that of Kira's, that they aren't that different from each other. I mentioned it earlier and made a whole video discussing it here, which you can find a link to in the description, but Light is driven by a combined sense of guilt and ego. We can see he felt guilty for what he did to the second guy, and he even mentions near the end when he finally gets cornered that nobody else would keep going, and that he couldn't stop. Essentially, the sunk cost fallacy is that by the second kill, he had gone too far to turn back at that point. And the fact that his ego is so great, stopping would be him admitting that he was doing something wrong and evil. Something he even alludes to. If Kira loses, he's evil, so he's trying not to lose, because he could never admit he was wrong. Light lost the memories of the guilt that he felt and the power that he held as Kira, and he wanted to be a god because he held that power. But now he'd completely forgotten that he held that power, and the guilt that came with it, and that he ever wanted to create or be the god of a new world. He was no longer blinded by the guilt or ego he gained. I, myself, am firmly against the idea that Light was literally corrupted by the book. I view the corruption as merely figurative, as I feel implying the book made Light do what he did would undermine the cautionary tale that Light represents. A major crux of the story is driven by Light's ego and how his inability to control it leads to his eventual downfall. That's kind of watered down if he wasn't acting on his own accord, but rather, the book itself doesn't corrupt you, it's the power to kill. As the saying goes, power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. That's not to say Light was always evil, of course. He was a 17-year-old given power no human should ever possess. He was operating off of a teenager's sense of right and wrong that probably most people would grow out of, as they would realize it's wrong. But because of the events of the story, he was never able to do that. The book never gave him traits. It merely gave him the ability to act on traits that were always there, and enhance them. And that is kind of all I got for this one. Now, if you guys liked what I had to say here and want to do me a favor by liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing, and following me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, I would greatly appreciate it. I should be back with more videos soon. Thank you, and have a nice day.